I knew something was wrong the moment the light caught on her hand. It wasn't the sparkle that stopped me, it was the shape. A slim oval stone, pale like morning frost, set low in a thin gold band. My ring. The one I had held between my fingers in a pawn shop months earlier, telling myself I could always get it back. I stood in my sister's doorway with a grocery bag cutting into my palm, my mouth half open, my heart suddenly too loud for my chest. She was laughing about something small, burnt cookies, I think, and waving her hands as she talked. The ring flashed again, careless and familiar, and in that instant, something in me shifted, like a picture frame knocked crooked on the wall. Nothing fell, nothing broke, but I knew I would never see the room the same way again. "Do you like it?" she asked, noticing my stare. I nodded because that's what I'd always done with my sister. I nodded because I didn't trust my voice, and because a long time ago I learned how to swallow questions whole. Before all of this, before the money vanished, before the ring, my life had a steady rhythm, not glamorous, not easy, but familiar enough to feel safe. I'd been married to David for 17 years. He was the quiet kind of man who believed love meant showing up, not saying much. He paid the bills on time, fixed the leaky faucet when it dripped, and brought home grocery store flowers on our anniversary because he never remembered the date but always remembered the feeling. We had a small house with a narrow kitchen where two people couldn't pass without brushing shoulders. I liked that. It made the place feel alive. I worked as an office coordinator for a medical supply company, answering phones, ordering inventory, smoothing over little fires before they spread. I wasn't ambitious, but I was reliable. Until the layoffs came. It happened on a Wednesday, right after lunch. The HR woman's voice was soft, apologetic, like she was telling me about a death in the family. I cleaned out my desk in silence, folded my cardigan over my arm, and walked to my car feeling oddly calm. Shock does that to you. It wraps everything in cotton. When I told David that evening, he pulled me into his chest and said, "We'll be fine. We've got savings." Savings. That word carried us through the next few months like a promise. We agreed he'd handle the finances while I looked for work. It made sense. He'd always been good with numbers. I trusted him. Marriage to me was built on quiet agreements like that. Who takes out the trash, who remembers birthdays, who holds the worry so the other can sleep. My sister, Marlene, lived across town. She was younger than me by 3 years, louder, quicker to laugh, quicker to anger. Where I was careful, she was bold. Where I waited, she leapt. Growing up, our mother used to say Marlene was the spark and I was the wick. Together, we burned bright. Separately, we struggled. We'd had our seasons of closeness and distance, like most sisters do. At that time, we were in a good place. She'd recently ended a long relationship and leaned on me in quiet ways. Late-night calls, spontaneous coffee dates, borrowed sweaters she never returned. I didn't mind. I liked being needed. On Sundays, David and I would drive to her place for dinner. The smell of garlic and onions would hit us before we reached the door. Marlene cooked like she lived, without measuring, without fear. She talked with her hands, swore when she dropped things, laughed at her own jokes. David seemed to enjoy her company more than I noticed at first. He listened to her stories, asked follow-up questions, complimented her cooking. I told myself I was imagining things. When the money started getting tight, it happened slowly. David would sigh when the mail came. He'd suggest eating in instead of ordering out. Once he mentioned dipping into savings for the mortgage just for a month or two. I nodded. That's what savings were for, right? Then one afternoon, while folding laundry, I asked him how much we had left. He didn't look up from his phone. "Not much," he said. Something in his tone made me pause. What does "not much" mean? He hesitated just a second too long. It went faster than I expected. Bills. Stuff adds up. I remember the hum of the dryer behind me, the way a sock slipped from my fingers. "How much is left, David?" he said quietly. "Almost gone." The words settled between us like dust. I wanted to ask more, but I didn't. I didn't want to sound accusatory. I didn't want to admit how afraid I suddenly felt. That night, I lay awake listening to his breathing, even and steady. I told myself this was what marriage looked like when things got hard, trusting even when your hand shook. A week later, I went to the pawn shop. It smelled of metal and old carpet. The man behind the counter didn't look at me when I placed the ring down. My ring. David had given it to me on our 10th anniversary after saving for months. He'd chosen it because he said it looked like me. Simple, quiet, strong. I told myself this was temporary. I signed the papers with a hand that felt detached from my body. When I walked out, the sun was too bright. I sat in my car and cried until my chest hurt, then wiped my face and drove home. David hugged me when I told him. He thanked me. He said I was brave. I believed him. Months passed. Job interviews that led nowhere, rejections wrapped in polite language. I learned how to stretch meals, how to ignore the ache of missing something I couldn't quite name. I stopped thinking about the ring. I had to. Then came the afternoon at Marlene's door. The ring on her hand glinted again as she reached for the grocery bag. "You didn't have to bring all this," she said. "Come in, you look tired." Inside, her apartment smelled of lemon cleaner and coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from our mugs. She talked about a new project at work, about a man she'd met who was not serious. I watched her hands as she spoke, the way she twisted the ring absently, sliding it up and down her finger like it belonged there. My heart thudded. "That ring," I said, trying to sound casual, "it's beautiful." She smiled, quick and bright. "Yeah, it was a gift." "A gift?" My mouth felt dry. She shrugged. "You know, someone special." I stared into my coffee, the surface trembling slightly. In my head, a quiet voice whispered that this was a coincidence, that rings looked alike, that I was tired and seeing ghosts. But another voice, older, steadier, told me something had been taken from me long before the ring ever left my hand. I went home that night with a knot in my stomach and a question I wasn't ready to ask. I didn't say anything to David that night. I wanted to. The question sat on my tongue like a bitter pill. "Have you seen Marlene's ring?" But I swallowed it down with my dinner and told myself I was being paranoid. Years of being the older sister had trained me to smooth things over before they could wrinkle. Years of marriage had taught me that accusations, once spoken, could never be taken back. Still, sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, staring at the ceiling fan as it made its slow, uneven circle. David's arm rested heavy across my waist, familiar and warm. I tried to listen to the rhythm of his breathing the way I always had, tried to let it calm me. Instead, my mind replayed the image of Marlene's hand in the air, the ring catching the light again and again, like it was trying to get my attention. The next morning, I woke up before dawn and padded into the kitchen. The house smelled faintly of last night's dish soap and coffee grounds. I poured myself a cup and sat at the table, wrapping my hands around the mug even though it burned. I asked myself 1,000 questions, none of them out loud. Why would Marlene have a ring like mine? Who gave it to her? And why did my husband's face flicker in my mind every time I tried to picture another answer? By mid-morning, I had convinced myself to let it go. I had an interview that afternoon and I needed my focus. I pressed my blouse, practiced answers in the mirror, told myself I was still a capable woman with a life beyond suspicion. The interview went well enough, but as I drove home, my phone buzzed with a message from Marlene. "Thanks again for yesterday. David said he liked the roast, too." I stared at the screen at a red light, my fingers suddenly numb. David said he liked the roast, too. I hadn't mentioned seeing David recently. I hadn't mentioned dinner plans. And yet, there it was, slipped casually into a text like it belonged. When I got home, David was in the living room watching television, feet propped on the coffee table. He smiled when he saw me. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Fine," I said. My voice sounded far away to my own ears. "Did you see Marlene yesterday?" He paused, just for a moment. "Yeah, I stopped by to return her baking dish." "Oh," I said, "I didn't know she lent you one." "She did," he said quickly, "last week." I nodded, my heart thudding again. "She was wearing a new ring." He shrugged, eyes back on the screen. "She mentioned that." "Did she?" I asked. He said, distracted. "Looks nice on her." That was all. I went into the bedroom and closed the door quietly. My hands shook as I sat on the edge of the bed. I told myself I was overreacting. I told myself siblings borrowed dishes and husbands ran errands and rings were just rings. But something inside me, something I'd ignored for too long, was wide awake now. Over the next few weeks, I paid attention in a way I hadn't before. Not obsessively, just carefully. I noticed how often David mentioned Marlene in passing, how his phone was suddenly always face down, how he volunteered to run errands that took him across town more than they used to. I noticed how Marlene stopped calling me late at night, how she canceled coffee plans with vague excuses, how she started dressing differently, more polished, more deliberate, when we did see each other. Once at a family barbecue, I watched them from across the yard as they stood near the grill. David leaned in when he laughed. Marlene touched his arm when she spoke. It was subtle, easy to miss, easy to explain away. But I didn't miss it. Still, I said nothing. Instead, I did something I had never done in my marriage. I checked the bank account. David had changed the password months earlier, saying it was for security reasons. At the time, I'd accepted it without question. Now, sitting at the computer with my heart pounding, I tried combinations that came to mind. Our anniversary, our dog's name, his birthday. Nothing. I sat back in the chair, staring at the screen, feeling foolish. This was his domain, he'd said. He'd take care of it, and I had let him. That afternoon, I drove to the pawn shop. The bell over the door chimed when I walked in, sharp and metallic. The same man stood behind the counter. He recognized me, his eyes flicking briefly to my left hand. "I want to check on a ring," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. He nodded, asked for my paperwork. I slid it across the counter with fingers that trembled only slightly. He disappeared into the back and returned a minute later, empty-handed. "I'm sorry," he said. "That item was redeemed." "Redeemed? When?" "About 6 weeks ago," he said, glancing at his screen. "Cash transaction." "By who?" I asked. He hesitated. "I can't give out customer information." I nodded, swallowing. "Of course." I walked out into the parking lot and sat in my car with the engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel. 6 weeks ago. I counted backward in my head. 6 weeks ago, David had told me the money was almost gone. 6 weeks ago, Marlene had stopped calling me. I drove home slowly, my thoughts circling like vultures.
When I pulled into the driveway, David's car was already there. He was home early. Inside, the house felt too quiet. He was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables. "Hey," he said, "thought I'd make dinner." I leaned against the counter and watched him, the way his hands moved confidently, familiarly. The man I had trusted with my life, my finances, my heart. "David," I said softly, "did you redeem my ring?" The knife stopped mid-chop. "What?" he said, not looking at me. "The ring, the one I pawned." He set the knife down slowly, turned to face me. "Why would you ask that?" "Because it was redeemed 6 weeks ago, and because Marlene is wearing a ring just like it." His face went pale, then flushed. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" I asked. He laughed, sharp and defensive. "You're connecting things that don't belong together." "Then explain it," I said. My voice shook now. "Explain why my ring is gone. Explain why my sister has one just like it. Explain why you're lying to me." "I haven't been lying," he snapped. "You're just stressed. This job loss has messed with your head." The words stung more than I expected. I straightened. "Don't do that. Don't make this about me." Silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Finally, he spoke, quieter. "I helped Marlene out. She needed money. I redeemed the ring to sell it for her." "For her," I repeated. "With my ring." "She paid me back," he said quickly. "Mostly." "Mostly," I echoed. I looked at him then, really looked. The man who wouldn't meet my eyes, the man who had taken something precious from me without asking and given it to my sister. "Are you sleeping with her?" He flinched. That was answer enough. The room seemed to tilt. I reached for the counter to steady myself. In that moment, the betrayal unfurled fully. Not just the money, not just the ring, but the quiet intimacy they'd built behind my back. The jokes, the glances, the shared secrets. "I trusted you," I said. My voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to happen. She was there. She listened. You were always worried, always tired." "Stop," I said. "Just stop." I left the kitchen and went into the bedroom, closing the door with care. I sat on the bed and pressed my face to the pain as it came in waves. Grief, anger, shame, all tangled together. Later that night, after David had fallen asleep on the couch, I lay awake again, this time not confused, not doubting, but clear. They had taken from me quietly, assuming I would never look too closely, assuming I would keep nodding, keep swallowing, keep the peace. They were wrong. I didn't confront Marlene right away, not because I didn't want to, but because I needed to understand the shape of what I was dealing with. Rage has a way of blinding you, and I'd already spent too many years walking through life with my eyes half closed. The morning after David's confession, if you could call it that, I woke up before him. The house felt different, like it had shifted in the night while I wasn't looking. I stood in the bathroom brushing my teeth, staring at my reflection. My face looked older somehow. Not ruined, just stripped of illusion. David was still asleep on the couch, his mouth slightly open, one arm flung over his eyes. I covered him with a blanket out of habit, then stopped halfway through the motion. Even kindness felt complicated now. Instead, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my notebook. Not for journaling, for accounting. If they'd taken money, I needed to know how much. If they'd lied, I needed to know for how long. And if I was going to move forward, I needed facts more than feelings. By mid-morning, David was awake, hovering in doorways like a man unsure of his place. He tried to talk. I told him I needed space. For once, he didn't argue. I drove to the bank. Sitting in the small office with the financial advisor, I felt exposed and embarrassed, like I was confessing a personal failure. The woman across from me spoke gently, sliding papers across the desk. She explained that David had transferred funds from our joint savings account into a personal account months earlier, an account I hadn't known existed. He had signing authority, she said carefully, so it wasn't illegal. Of course not, I murmured. By the time I left, my hands were steady again. The numbers were worse than I'd expected. Not just the ring, not just a few withdrawals. Almost all of it was gone, spent in pieces, spread out enough to avoid notice. Gas, groceries, restaurants across town. Marlene lived across town. I sat in my car afterward and let myself cry once, hard and fast. Then I wiped my face and started the engine. That afternoon, I called Marlene. She answered on the third ring, breathless. "Hey, everything okay?" "I saw your ring," I said. Silence. "I went to the pawn shop. It was redeemed." Another pause, longer this time. "Look," she said finally, her voice tight, "I didn't think it would hurt you like this." "Hurt me like what? Like stealing from me or sleeping with my husband?" She gasped. "Lower your voice. I'm alone. You don't get to tell me how to speak anymore." She sighed, the sound heavy with irritation rather than guilt. "It just happened. We were both lonely. You were always stressed, always talking about bills." "Stop," I said, echoing myself from the night before. "You don't get to explain my pain away." "I didn't ask him to take the ring," she said quickly. "That was his idea." That cut deeper than I expected, not because it absolved her, but because it revealed how easily they had discussed my life like it was a resource to be managed. "Give it back," I said, "the ring." "I can't. I sold it." My chest tightened. "You sold it?" "I needed the money," she said defensively. "You know how things have been for me." I laughed then, a short, hollow sound. "You needed it more than I did. Is that what you're telling yourself?" "I'm your sister," she snapped. "You're supposed to understand." I closed my eyes. "I did understand," I said softly. "That's the problem." We hung up without saying goodbye. That evening I told David to leave. Not dramatically, not with shouting or thrown dishes. I simply told him I needed him out of the house. He tried to argue, he cried, he apologized. He said it was a mistake, that he loved me, that Marlene meant nothing. I listened quietly, then handed him a printed copy of the bank statements. "You made choices. Now I'm making mine." He packed a bag and left. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded final in a way shouting never could. The next weeks were a blur of paperwork and quiet grief. I filed for separation. I met with a lawyer who spoke in careful terms about assets and accountability. I started a new job, part-time at first, then full-time as a receptionist at a small law firm. The work grounded me. Phones rang, papers shuffled. Life went on. Marlene tried to reach out once. A text. "Can we talk?" I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in explanations anymore. I was interested in healing. At a family gathering months later, the truth surfaced the way these things often do, slowly, awkwardly, in pieces. An offhand comment, a question asked too loudly, my mother's confused frown. I didn't tell the story with bitterness. I told it plainly, about the money, about the ring, about the affair. The room fell quiet. Marlene stared at the floor. David wasn't there. My mother reached for my hand, her grip tight and apologetic. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I know," I said. The consequences weren't explosive. No shouting matches, no dramatic scenes. Just a subtle shift. Invitations grew scarce for Marlene. Conversations cooled. Trust, once broken, did not knit itself back together easily. As for me, I learned something I hadn't known before. Dignity isn't loud. It doesn't demand revenge or applause. Sometimes it simply stands up, gathers its things, and walks away from what no longer honors it. I never replaced the ring, but I didn't need to.
The house felt too big after David left. Not in the way you'd expect, not echoing or hollow, but unfamiliar, like a place I'd rented instead of lived in. I kept catching myself listening for sounds that never came, the click of his keys at the door, the low hum of his voice from the other room, the way he used to clear his throat before speaking when he was nervous. Grief doesn't always arrive with tears. Sometimes it shows up as habit, reaching for something that isn't there anymore. I started rearranging furniture, not all at once, just small shifts. The armchair moved closer to the window. The rug turned 90 degrees. I donated the stack of old magazines David never read but insisted on keeping. Each change felt like an exhale. Work became my anchor. The law firm was small, the staff mostly women who spoke plainly and laughed easily. They didn't pry, but they noticed. They brought me coffee on hard mornings. They taught me how to navigate the copier when it jammed, and shared stories over lunch about lives that had been broken and rebuilt. Listening to them, I realized something important. Betrayal wasn't rare, but survival was. Marlene remained silent after the family gathering. I heard things through the quiet channels of family gossip. She'd moved in with a friend. She was struggling at work. She wasn't doing well. The information slid past me without sticking. Sympathy had its limits, and I'd reached mine. One afternoon, months later, a padded envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a check. No note, no apology, just a cashier's check for an amount close to what the ring had fetched at resale. I sat at the kitchen table with it for a long time, the late afternoon light stretching shadows across the floor. My first instinct was anger. This doesn't fix anything. My second was relief. This helps. And beneath both was a quieter feeling I couldn't name right away. Choice. I deposited the check the next morning, not because it absolved her, but because it belonged to me. David tried to come back once. It was early evening when he knocked, standing on the porch with his hands in his pockets, his hair thinner than I remembered. He looked older, too, or maybe I was just seeing him clearly now. "I miss you," he said. "I've been in therapy. I made a mistake." I leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "You made many mistakes. I can fix it. We can start over." I studied his face, the earnestness, the fear, the hope. Once it would have undone me. Now it only made me tired. "Starting over isn't about going back," I said, "and I don't want to build another life with someone who could look me in the eye and take from me." He nodded slowly, swallowing. "Yes, I deserve that." "Yes," I said gently, "you do." When I closed the door, my hands were steady. The divorce finalized in the spring. The paperwork was unceremonious, the signatures final. I walked out of the courthouse into air that smelled like rain and felt lighter than I had in years. I took a weekend trip by myself soon after. Nothing extravagant, just a small coastal town a few hours away. I walked the boardwalk in the mornings, ate seafood at places with chipped paint and handwritten menus, watched the tide come in and out like it always had. One afternoon, while browsing a small jewelry shop, I saw a ring that made me pause. It wasn't like the old one. This one was wider, the band brushed instead of polished, the stones smaller and set off center. It felt grounded, unapologetic. I slipped it on my finger and held my hand up to the light, not to admire it, but to feel the weight. I didn't buy it.
Not yet. Back home, life settled into something new. Not perfect, not painless, but honest. My relationship with my mother softened in quiet ways, shared meals, long walks, conversations that didn't rush to fill silence. She apologized once tearfully for not seeing what was happening sooner. You raised me to speak up, I told her. I just had to learn how. Marlene sent a letter months later, a real one, on paper. She wrote about shame, about loneliness, about losing more than she'd gained. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't expect it. I read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness, I'd learned, isn't owed, it's offered when and if the heart is ready. I wasn't there yet, but I was healing. Some nights I still dreamed of the ring, not as it was lost, but as it had been the first time David slid it onto my finger, his hands shaking, his eyes full. In the dream, I didn't feel sadness, just gratitude for the woman I had been, and pride in the woman I'd become. I began volunteering at a local support group for women navigating divorce and financial recovery. I didn't share my story right away. I listened, I made coffee, I learned how powerful quiet presence could be. When I did speak, it wasn't about anger, it was about boundaries, about recognizing your own worth before someone else assigns it for you. One evening, a woman pulled me aside after a meeting. "How did you know when to leave?" she asked. I thought for a moment. When staying required me to disappear. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I squeezed her hand. At home that night, I stood in front of the mirror and slipped on the new ring I'd finally bought, a simple band, no stone at all. It caught the light differently than the old one, not flashy, but steady. It felt like a promise I was making to myself.
There is a particular kind of quiet that settles in after the storm has passed. It isn't empty, it isn't lonely, it's the quiet of a house that knows itself again. I noticed it most in the mornings, the way sunlight slipped through the kitchen window and rested on the counter like it belonged there. The way I could take my time making coffee, letting it brew strong instead of rushing to meet someone else's schedule. The way my thoughts felt less crowded. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, almost forgettable moments. Laughing at a joke without guilt, making plans without checking with anyone, saying no and not explaining myself. One afternoon, I ran into Marlene at the grocery store. I saw her first, standing near the produce, comparing prices with the intensity of someone trying to make every dollar behave. She looked thinner, tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. For a moment, I considered turning the cart around. Instead, I breathed in and walked forward. She noticed me just as I reached for the apples. Her face flushed, then softened. "Hi," she said. "Hi," I replied. We stood there, the hum of refrigeration filling the space between us. Ordinary people passed, unaware that something once precious had broken right there in the aisle. "I've been meaning to ask if you got the letter," she said quietly. "I did." She nodded, eyes flicking down to my hand, to the new ring. I saw the recognition there, and something else. Regret, maybe, or understanding. "I'm sorry," she said. The words were plain, no excuses trailing behind them. I studied her face, the sister who'd shared a room with me as a child, who'd borrowed my clothes and my secrets, who'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. "I believe you're sorry. That doesn't mean things go back to how they were." "I know," she whispered. We stood there another moment, then I picked up my apples and placed them in my cart. "Take care of yourself," I said. "You too," she replied. And that was it. No hug,
No reconciliation montage, just honesty. And sometimes that's enough. The support group continued to grow. Word spread. More women came, some angry, some numb, some still deciding whether they were ready to leave or stay. I never told them what to do. I told them what I learned. That trust without transparency isn't peace, it's silence. That love doesn't ask you to make yourself smaller. That dignity is not negotiable. One evening after a meeting, I stayed late to help clean up. The chairs scraped softly against the floor as we stacked them. Someone left behind a scarf. I folded it neatly and placed it on the table, thinking of all the things women leave behind when they walk away from the wrong life. At home, I pulled out the old drawer where I'd placed Marlene's letter months earlier. I reread it slowly this time. The words still hurt, but they didn't own me. I wrote her a short reply. I accept your apology. I'm not ready to rebuild our relationship, but I wish you well. It took courage to stop there, to not soften it, to not promise more than I could give. When I sealed the envelope, my hand didn't shake. The anniversary of my layoff came quietly. I marked it not with sadness, but with gratitude. Losing that job had set everything else in motion, painful as it was. Sometimes the ground has to crack before anything new can grow. I treated myself to dinner that night, a small restaurant with dim lighting and linen napkins. I ordered dessert without asking anyone if they wanted to share. As I walked home afterward, the city lights blurred slightly, not from tears, but from the simple fullness of being alive. At home, I took off my coat and paused by the mirror. The woman looking back at me wasn't hardened, she wasn't bitter, she was clear. Clear about what she deserved, clear about what she would never accept again. I touched the ring on my finger, the smooth metal cool against my skin. It wasn't a symbol of loss anymore. It was a marker of return. Return to myself. Sometimes people ask if I miss my sister or my husband or the life I thought I had. The truth is, I miss the woman I used to be, naive, hopeful, generous to a fault, but I don't regret becoming someone stronger in her place. Because strength, I've learned, isn't about holding on. It's about knowing when to let go and trusting that you'll be enough on the other side. I keep the memory of the old ring not as a wound, but as a lesson. Nothing worth keeping should ever have to be taken from you. And if it is, you're allowed to walk away. People often think the end of a betrayal story is the confrontation, the shouting, the confession, the moment the truth finally spills out and everyone stands exposed. But that's never really the end. The real ending happens much later, in quieter places, in moments so ordinary you almost miss them if you're not paying attention. For me, one of those moments came on a Sunday afternoon, nearly a year after David moved out. I was standing in the kitchen, chopping onions for soup. The radio played softly in the background, one of those old songs I used to skip because David didn't like it. The window was cracked open, letting in the sound of children playing somewhere down the block. My eyes burned from the onions, and for a second I laughed at myself. I was crying over onions. And it struck me how different that felt from the crying I'd done before. This kind passed. I stirred the pot slowly, wooden spoon scraping the bottom, the steam fogging my glasses. The house smelled warm and lived in, safe, not perfect, but honest. I sat at the table with my bowl of soup and thought about how many meals I'd eaten while swallowing my feelings along with my food, how many times I'd nodded, agreed, stayed quiet just to keep things smooth. Peace, I had learned the hard way, isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of self-respect. A few weeks later, I received a message from a woman who attended the support group only once. She'd been quiet, sitting near the back, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her message was short. I left. I was terrified, but I left. Thank you for saying it was okay to choose myself. I read it twice, then set my phone down and closed my eyes. That was when I knew something inside me had fully shifted. My pain had become useful, not in a dramatic, inspirational way, but in the most human way possible. It had given me language. It had given me boundaries. It had given me a backbone I didn't know I was allowed to grow. I still see Marlene occasionally, family events, mutual spaces. We are polite, careful. There's a distance between us now that I don't rush to close. Some wounds scar instead of sealing cleanly, and that's not failure, that's memory doing its job. David, on the other hand, has faded into the background of my life, not erased, but no longer centered. I hear updates through other people sometimes. He's dating, he's working on himself, he's doing better. I hope that's true, but his healing is no longer my responsibility. That realization, simple as it sounds, took years to earn. One evening, while cleaning out an old drawer, I found the receipt from the pawn shop. Folded, yellowed at the edges. I must have tucked it away without thinking, like people do with things they're not ready to let go of. I held it between my fingers for a long moment. Then I tore it in half. Not angrily, not ceremoniously, just finished. I threw it away and washed my hands, watching the water run clear over my skin. That night I slept deeply. No dreams, no reliving, just rest. People sometimes ask me if I believe in forgiveness. I do, but I believe in timing more. Forgiveness that's rushed becomes another way women are taught to abandon themselves, another way we're told to be the bigger person while still bleeding. Real forgiveness doesn't demand performance. It arrives when the heart feels safe enough to open again. And sometimes forgiveness doesn't look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like peace. I've learned to measure my life differently now, not by how much I give, not by how much I endure, but by how much of myself I get to keep. I keep my mornings slow. I keep my finances transparent. I keep my boundaries firm and my circle small. And I keep my promises to myself most of all. Every once in a while, I think about the old ring, the one that passed from my hand into someone else's life without my consent. The symbol of how easily something precious can be taken when you trust the wrong people with it. But I don't ache for it anymore, because the truth is, the ring was never the most valuable thing I lost. That was my silence, and I got that back. If you're listening to this story and something in it feels familiar, if you've ever trusted someone with your money, your loyalty, your love, only to realize they treated it like something disposable, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not foolish for trusting, you are not weak for loving, and you are not cruel for choosing yourself when someone proves they cannot be trusted with you. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop explaining your worth to people who benefit from not understanding it. So I'll leave you with this question, the one I asked myself when everything finally went quiet. If the people closest to you were treating your dignity like spare change, would you keep paying the price or would you walk away? Tell me in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that your life, your peace, and your future matter, please like, subscribe, and stay with me. Because these stories aren't just about betrayal, they're about becoming whole again.